So obviously we know, don't we, that the centre of the Christian faith, we know, is the cross and the resurrection, Jesus coming back to life. Those are the things that, and that last week of Jesus' life, more than anything else, you see in the witness accounts of Jesus, you see that last week of his life, starting with Palm Sunday, starting there and all the way through leading up, is in a lot of detail. You get that more than almost any other part. And we're going to just look at that scene, as I said, in Gethsemane, in the garden. Just after, so he's had the meal, the last with his disciples, with his followers. And he's all, at this point already told them, he said, look, I'm going to get delivered up to death. He's already told, I'm going to get betrayed by one of you tonight. And he's also then said that the rest of you are going to abandon me. See, Jesus knows what's coming for him. And before those events then start to unfold in the early hours of the morning, he goes out to this garden called Gethsemane, a place nearby. And it's that we're going to look at today. Those are the events that we're going to look at. It's not just that we're talking about those events happening, but it's their significance for us in that what happened then in the life of Jesus, in his death and his resurrection. It's like a pebble that's dropped into a pond that has ripples that go throughout time and throughout all peoples, that it has an effect over. Jesus came to save us. That is the message of Christianity, and it's about his rule and reign filling the whole earth. So these events, this garden and all of the other events that happened over this Easter period, they matter to us now. And as we read through it, I just want to to think about three things really. One is Jesus' humanity, which is that's the human, that's about thinking about Jesus fully human. And then secondly, to think about Jesus being his journey to the cross, and that there was no other way. This was the only way that was possible, and he was the only one qualified to do it. One way. And then thirdly, I want us to think about what it is, and this is represented by this cup, but what it was that was so distressing and so troubling for Jesus in those hours in this garden. So we're going to read the passage together. And this is it, and it's in every one of the witness accounts. The four Gospels talk about Gethsemane, some in more detail than others. But we're going to read it from Mark 14, and it starts at verse 32, and it says this: Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. And then he said to them, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch." And he went a little further, and he fell to the ground, and he prayed, if it were possible, that the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not I will, but what you will." And then he came and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, why are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and he prayed, and he spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know how to answer him. And then he came a third time, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It's enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand." So Jesus, he takes his disciples to this garden. And we're told elsewhere that it's a familiar place to them. And before that, he's instructed them and delivered to them the instructions around the Lord's Supper about taking the bread and wine. And they're sleepy at this point, and Jesus isn't though. They're ready to turn it in, but for him, he is telling them all about this really important stuff that is happening, and he's distressed and troubled. And it says in other accounts, it says he was crushed with grief, and Luke says he sweat blood, which is a medical condition that seems very rare and only happens in times of intense stress. And it asks that he asks them, and he says, "Go and keep watch while I pray." And he does it 3 times, and he comes back each time and he finds them asleep. And the scene passes it's probably likely to have passed over a few hours if you imagine these disciples, the to-ing and fro-ing and the falling asleep. Jesus wants them to see what's going on and even be part of it, and he asks them to watch and pray. And it's not like he's asking them to be like on guard duty. I think it's meant more in the spiritually awake and spiritually alert to what is happening. Jesus wants them to see it and be part of it with him. But they don't, and he's left alone with God, crying out, thinking about what's ahead of him. And the scene ends with him being arrested, and he faces his trial and his death alone, and he is betrayed and he is abandoned. So that first thing I want to consider is Jesus, his humanity then. What does that mean? See, in the beginning of Mark's Gospel, it says this, the beginning of the Gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. See, sometimes I think it's easy to think of Jesus as superhuman when you read about the miracles and the power that he displays with things like the calming of the storm and the other miracles he does. And it's easy to miss that Jesus is fully human. His power and authority, that means he is the Son of God, but he's also vulnerable and able to suffer, fully human. And Gethsemane, like no other place, I would say, shows that clearly. We see Jesus here troubled and distressed and overwhelmed about what's facing him. And he's not like a superhuman where this stuff just bounces off him. We see him in the deep throes of emotion and distress. And we see it elsewhere. We see other emotions in other places. But here we see it at its fullest extent. And Jesus in this moment also chooses. He says, not my will, but yours. And that's another way we talk about what it means to be human. It's our ability to make choices. We don't just act on our impulses. Of course, sometimes we talk about doing that. But actually, as humans, we've got this ability to be able to choose and override how we're feeling in the moment. That's what it means to have a will. To make a choice based on all the stuff about what it seems good to us to do. The Gospels talk about Jesus choosing all the time, and it's always with the same thought. And John 14:31, Jesus says this, I do as the Father has commanded, so the world may know that I love the Father. See, Jesus is always in step with the Father, and it is love and trust that motivates him. And here in the garden, of all the places, we see Jesus choosing, resisting an easier and less painful option, choosing obedient trust over immediate relief. And that's a choice to be about what it is to be human. When Jesus goes to the cross, he suffers. He will bleed, he will feel the flogging, the nails, he will feel abandoned, he will feel betrayed, and he will feel humiliation and injustice, and then he will die. He wasn't Superman, he's fully God, but fully man. And we're told also that it's not only for the love of God that he did these things, but it was for the love of his Father, but it's also for the love of us that he stepped into our world. It's love and obedient trust that lead Jesus to humble himself, the Son of God, and step into our world and endure the worst of it. And secondly then, I want to just say something about there was only one way. Because that's what this is all about as well. When Jesus comes into the garden, it seems that it might seem like he's having a change of heart. He says, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Is there another way? Are he and his Father at odds over this plan? I don't think so. Jesus knows what's coming. He's predicted his death many times. In Mark alone, it's recorded 3 times he speaks about what will happen, about his death and his resurrection. Gethsemane is an intensification of the battle that Jesus faced throughout his whole sinful life. A life that was about total obedience and trust to God. We see a similar battle going on 3 years earlier when he's in the wilderness, right at the beginning of his kind of ministry, where he's tempted by the devil to shortcut God's plan for his life, to choose an easier route. But Jesus, we're told in Hebrews 4 that Jesus was tempted in every way, but was without sin. And I was talking with someone the other day, and they were talking about resisting the urge to drink alcohol. And you never know the full intensity of something until you have to resist it. See, we've been looking at the Lord's Prayer over recent weeks, and it says this: lead me not into temptation. And here we see Jesus finding his refuge in God in his most testing moment. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus seems to draw strength from this time of intimate prayer with his Father. See, this isn't God who is a father who's uncaring. This is a father and son that are embracing in prayer. The son showing a wholehearted commitment and trust to his father as he sees what is before him. And he's echoing what he's done his whole life. I only do what I see the Father doing. Your will be done. Jesus' life of obedience qualifies him as our perfect substitute in his place. Jesus trusted God because there was no other way in which justice could be served and grace poured out. In 2 Corinthians 5:21 it says this, speaking of Jesus, it says, He made him who knew no sin to be sin in our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. An easier version, translation of that is, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we might be made right with God through Christ. Was there another way? The answer in Gethsemane is no. And the Son of God gets up after these hours of prayer to go and fulfill their rescue plan for creation. To appreciate the cross, we've got to understand both the majesty of God and the seriousness of sin and evil. And one writer says, the cross is the surest and the truest and the deepest window on the very heart and the character of the living and loving God. But there is one break from the parallels with the Lord's Prayer in this. We pray in the Lord's Prayer, it says, deliver us from evil. But in Gethsemane, what we see is Jesus being delivered up to evil. And so that's where we get to this final bit, which is around Jesus. What is it that causes him such distress in the garden? The line that tells us that, tells us of his anguish, tells us of his distress, is this one. Take this cup away from me. In Matthew's account it says, let this cup of suffering be taken from me. Jesus knew what was coming. Jesus made decisions every day to submit to God's will. He was motivated by love and trust to remain in step. But it is at Gethsemane and the enormity of what is about to happen to him. It's like one of those moments in life when you've been thinking or you've been preparing about it, and then the full intensity of it grips you just before it happens. So that might be you go to the funeral of a loved one, or it might be you're walking up the aisle, or it might be you're entering the exam hall. Jesus is suddenly confronted with one of those moments, the moment. He's confronted with the reality of all that he's going to face. When we went to Zambia a few years ago, I thought it'd be a good idea to book a zip line experience across the Zambezi River by the Victoria Falls. I just thought it would offer us a unique perspective to see the falls if we were 100 metres over the Zambezi on a wire in the middle. And I booked it with quite a bit of excitement, a little bit of apprehension, thinking as a family, are we all going to be able to manage it? During the time leading up to it, I was thinking about it. Yeah, it could be a good idea, whatever. But I tell you what, it was the moment when I strapped on the harnesses and we were on the edge of the cliff and you're looking down 100 metres over this gorge and you've got the Victoria Falls there. And it was that moment when it hit me fully. Is this stupid? My parental responsibilities of sending my kids across this, and they wanted one of the kids to go across first, suddenly hit me. The full weight of this suddenly hit me full. And so that's what Jesus is there. He's at that moment of the reality of what is about to happen to him is hitting him full. And it isn't the thought of the physical suffering Although crucifixion was brutally painful and cruel, and it wasn't the abandonment or the humiliation or betrayal of other people, even his friends. And it wasn't the injustice of it all even. Jesus knew he didn't deserve what was coming to him. Of course, all of those things are in the mix of it, but that wasn't the focal point of what he said his distress was. What Jesus feared was taking this cup that was his to drink. Jesus wasn't fearful because the outcome was unknown or uncertain. And of course you can be afraid of things because you don't know what it's like. But you can equally suffer and be afraid exactly because you do know what it's going to be like. You can ask any mum who's had a second child what childbirth. The cup was the thing. This was the cup of God's judgment over sin. Here are some verses that just describe what that cup's like in vivid details. Jeremiah 25 says this: "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me. Take from my hand this cup filled with the wine of my wrath and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. When they drink it, they will stagger and go mad because of the sword I will send among them." And Jeremiah then goes on to having this vision, this passing around of this cup to every nation listed off, and each will take their sip of this cup, and each of them will experience the judgment of their particular actions, their evil, their wickedness. Wrath means anger in the most intense sense. It's not a word of mild irritation. It's got strongest of feelings. Psalm 75 says this: "It is the God who judges. He brings down one, he exalts another. In the hand of the Lord is a cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very dregs." And the same imagery is used in the New Testament. In Revelation 14 it says, "Drinking the wine of God's fury, which has poured full strength into the cup of his wrath." And it's these images of the cup that Jesus has in his mind as he cries out in the garden. God's anger and judgment of sin and evil. And I hope perhaps as I've been preparing this, like me, you start to feel a bit uncomfortable. Of course, there's imagery in these verses, but the feelings and the thoughts behind them that they evoke in us are important. Hearing these words about God being judging or angry, his wrath should cause us some uneasiness. It's hard to read these verses and not want to shrink back from them. It's like trying to look at the sunlight and having to turn away. I remember I had to go to coroner's court. I was only likely to be called as a witness. But as I sat in the courtroom, the whole experience was quite deeply uncomfortable. It's just deeply uncomfortable. This search for truth, this judgment of things, it kind of hits you. And I find comfort sometimes in God's judgment, though, when I know the atrocities that we've heard about in something like Ukraine. And I find comfort that all truth will be brought out, that God will vindicate, that God will bring justice and bring fairness. But I find it so much less comforting when it's my own motives and actions that are being examined. My experience is also that we don't like to think about anger generally. That's been my experience. When I do some sessions with kids around big feelings and things that they're struggling with, they'll happily trot out feelings like happy, even sad and even worried. But I tell you what, anger never really hits the list very easily. We avoid it. We don't like to think about anger, probably because our experience of it are often about flawed human beings who lose their temper impulsively and for all sorts of reasons. Some of them might be justified, but then it comes out in some very unhelpful ways. And doesn't it also say, isn't God love? Isn't anger contrary to love? But I would suggest God is angry at evil and sin precisely because he is all good and all loving, just like we've been saying. We don't have time to go into God's anger and God's wrath in great detail today, only to say that it's not like flawed human experiences. We must speak of it with absolute care, but we must also take it seriously. But even the most basic examples would suggest that anger is a reaction to to love. If I didn't get angry when someone hurt one of my kids, then you'd hardly think I love them. Last year in Germany, I walked around the Holocaust museums and a concentration camp. Of course, a God of love and goodness is going to be angry at that stuff and going to hate it. If God doesn't get angry at abuse, at genocide, at deceit, at racism, how can we say he's good and just and fair? And it's true that he says every injustice and unfairness will be exposed under the full light of his truth. Even evil, sin and wickedness is everything that God isn't. It's not surprising then that the Bible's attitude describes God's attitude to it in these terms that are the most strongest and the most personal. The strength of my own feelings of justice and anger grow in intensity to be connected to the very things that I love the most. So this cup that is before God, before Jesus, the moment where the full emotional reality of it is looking over the cliff edge. The sinless one who has only ever trusted and obeyed God absolutely. Jesus at the cross is going to take on that right judgment and punishment that was ours and experience it himself. And it's that cup that Jesus is staggering to bear as he falls into his Father's arms, resisting the last great temptation to choose an easier way. To trust completely in God's plan, to submit fully to their plan that Jesus himself fully understands, which is that in Isaiah 53 it says of Jesus, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Love is what motivates Father and Son in the plan. The upholding of all that is good and just in God. At the cross, one writer says this, at the cross in the holy love, God through Christ paid the full penalty of our disobedience himself. For Jesus isn't an unfortunate or unwilling victim. He chooses an obedience and trust in the Father, and he faces the most terrible and fearsome thing. It says here in Hebrews 12, "Dear Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the Father, because he loves us, though we're separated by our sin, wants to be reconciled to us. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." But the next verse, John 3:17 says, "For God did not send Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." God removes his condemnation, his rightful judgment over us, because Jesus became the willing substitute in our place. What motivates Father and Son is their love for us and for one another. That's why Jesus is in this garden for hours from his death, to take on himself our judgment, the consequences of humans like me and you. So how do we respond to these things? Well, I'll suggest that Gethsemane is a glimpse of what Jesus faces at the cross, and the moment of assessing the cross before the reality comes. Cliff edge moment, if you like. It describes how as fully man he is uniquely qualified and fully committed to love and trust of God, the Father. We see Jesus fully man, fully God, taking on himself what we deserve. And it was also their merciful love that realised there was no other way. The holiness and anger of God are not things that we often think about, but we should. The greatest joy that we can know is to know the true and living God. We live in a world of preferences where everything is set to fit my preferences. And that will mean that if I'm in the centre, it means I shape God to fit me. And as one writer says it, I want to worship the God who is there. The one who is all loving, but he's also all just and hates every evil and injustice with an intensity that it deserves. But also shows his amazing mercy for us. While we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. And when we looked at this a week or so ago with our life group, one of the life group members made a profound statement at the end of it in terms of thinking about how we think. And he said, I'm like a disciple that's asleep. See, they hadn't understood what was at stake. When Jesus wanted them to watch and pray with him, they just dropped off. And it's interesting because I think prayer is a place where you measure your spiritual temperature. But after what Jesus did for them, they woke up to that. The Spirit opened their eyes and they did come to Jesus, understand and know Jesus in his power, of his death and his resurrection. And it changed them. And that's what Gethsemane is all about. Contemplating what Jesus endured for our sake. That was mine to carry, but no longer is. There is now no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. And 1 John 4:8 says this, God is love. But actually in those verses it goes on to say in 4:10, this is real love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice to take away our sin.